What's a fact that sounds like a conspiracy theory? Ernest Hemingway suffered from ongoing paranoia that the FBI were surveilling him, which was thought to be a key factor in his suicide. Most chalked it up to mental illness at the time. Decades later, his file was released, proving he was under investigation for his ties to Cuba, his phones were tapped, and he was right all along. Just because you're paranoid don't mean they're not after you. I've also heard it as, it's only paranoia if you're wrong. Otherwise you're justifiably observant. The Church of Scientology had members secretly infiltrate U.S. government agencies in order to destroy unfavorable documents and investigations into them. Funny addendum, they were also spying on Matt Stone and Trey Parker to try and blackmail them into backing off in South Park. They couldn't find anything more embarrassing than what Parker and Stone would already openly admit to the press. Probably really hard to embarrass those two. It's the super straight-laced folks with skeletons in the closet. Yeah, trying to attack people who give zero fucks with fuck you money isn't really gonna work. Tax service companies such as Intuit spend millions of dollars a year lobbying to make sure the IRS does not make it easier to file your taxes. Correct. It's actually quite common in many countries for the tax return people receive to already be pre-filled with the necessary data, because obviously the tax authorities know about them already. How do you think they catch you? All the taxpayer needs to do is review the information and make sure it's accurate, or add in anything that is missed. Since the majority of people have a straightforward return, single source of income and a fixed salary, the process literally takes a few minutes, costs them nothing, and that's it. It gets even better than that. I'm British, and most people don't even fill out a tax return. If you have one job, the tax is taken at source by your employer, PAYE, pay as you earn, and you don't need to do anything else. It only breaks down if you have a larger salary, investments, other income, and so on. I'm currently living abroad and have to fill out a tax return. Takes me about an hour. If I am due a refund, it happens in less than a week. US tax insanity constantly baffles me. There's a psychological reaction called the backfire effect, which essentially means that people, after they're given proof that what they think they know is absolutely wrong, will believe their misconception/misinformation even more deeply. So my wife has done some research on sacred beliefs, ideas that are fundamental to people's sense of identity, and when attacked or shown to be wrong, they tend to just double down on those ideas. The most effective way of getting someone to change their mind about those appears to be more of a Socratic method: slowly lead them to the conclusion and let them really do the problem solving to prove themselves wrong. It's like the sunk cost fallacy that keeps investors holding on to loss-making stocks. Only this time the sunk cost is not money but social capital, credibility, etc. JFK's brain was removed during autopsy and stored in an archive. Its current whereabouts are unknown. I've read about that. It does seem like a conspiracy theory. I believe Einstein had something similar happen to his. I think the honest answer is a total lack of medical ethics by the pathologist doing the autopsy, and just how weird and pointless storing his brain was in the first place. Like, I can see it being shuffled around by archivists who are like, why the fuck do we have this? Put it over there for years until nobody actually remembers where it is. Whose brain did you steal? Abby someone, I don't know. In the 60s and 70s, thousands of Native American women were sterilized without their consent as part of a practice to sterilize poor and minority women to help their financial situation and their family's quality of life. By preventing unwanted pregnancies in poor communities. Some were not informed at all and had it done to them completely without their knowledge, others were threatened with having their healthcare taken away if they did not agree to have it done to them. Some studies estimate that as many as 25 to 50% of Native American women were sterilized in the 1970s, representing tens of thousands of victims. This is essentially a modern-day genocide in the United States. Diamond company De Beers sits on an estimated 50 years' worth of yearly carats sold in jewel-quality stones, purely to keep the market price high by creating artificial scarcity. Precious stones are, in fact, not so rare as to merit the high prices they command. They use diamonds in saw blades. They're not rare, nor are they expensive. I'll comment on this to further reinforce what I was going to say on the other comment. The diamonds used in saw blades are usually low-quality clarity-wise or not the right color. I remember a commercial for chocolate diamonds. It was all a marketing ploy to sell low-quality diamonds at a way higher rate than they would for their normal purpose. There was one recorded homicide in New York City on September 11, 2001. The people who died because of the attacks weren't considered part of the homicides for that day because a very high number like that is a statistical outlier that would throw off accurate record numbers. The one person who was murdered was a Polish immigrant named Henryk Siwiak, who was nowhere near the attacks. He was killed in the Bedford-Stuyvesant area of Brooklyn at around 11:40 p.m. So did other would-be murderers change their minds, or decide to wait a few days, or is one actually a pretty typical number? I'd expect it to be higher on average. The suicide rate briefly dipped around NYC after the attacks too. I believe the phenomenon is due to everyone having a shared crisis. We become more empathetic and more of a community. In the spring of 1968, President Lyndon Johnson shocked the nation when he announced that he would not seek election to a second full term that November. He gave no explanation, and pretty much everyone assumed that it was because of the situation in Vietnam and his resulting unpopularity. While Vietnam undoubtedly was a factor, it was far from the full story. Concerned that males in his family tended to die young, and having barely survived a heart attack in the 1950s, sometime in 1967 Johnson had commissioned a top-secret actuarial study to determine his likely lifespan. After carefully going through his family history and medical records, the actuaries concluded that Johnson was unlikely to survive to age 65. Johnson quickly did the math and realized that would give him a very short retirement if he ran and won in 1968, as he'd be 64 at the end of the term. This led him to decide against running. The actuaries were right, as Johnson never made it to 65, dying at age 64. And indeed it would have been a very short retirement. Had he served a second full term, he would have died less than 24 hours after the end of the term. Realistically, the stress of a second term would have likely killed him far sooner. Nearly every sitting president has stated the burden of their presidency had a severely negative impact on their health. Probably going to be buried, but this one is actually kind of funny. Sometime after WW2, the US was doing some pretty wild experiments, including trying to see if they could teach dolphins to talk. They believed this was only achievable by full immersion, so they built a house and filled it with water and had a researcher live with the dolphin. The dolphin was a young male and wouldn't respond to anything unless the female researcher jacked it off. It became too obsessed with the researcher, and I think when the higher-ups found out what was going on, they shut it down and never tried again. Kind of paraphrased, but yeah. The government paid a fuckload of money just to end up having a lady walk off a dolphin. The dolphin ended up committing suicide. I'm not kidding. It really fucked him up. Didn't they also try to get it to speak English and would punish him for speaking dolphin? Then they tried speaking dolphin to him, so he just stopped talking and eventually killed himself? Or was that the insane sensory deprivation tank LSD guy? My friend told me about all of this, but I was really stoned, so I may remember it wrong. Government surveillance. Whistleblower Edward Snowden revealed in 2013 that the U.S. National Security Agency, NSA, was conducting mass surveillance on citizens, collecting data from internet communications, phone calls, and other sources. It really is incredible how prior to Snowden you'd be treated as a tinfoil-wearing crazy person for believing there was widespread, massive government surveillance. And then the revelations came out and basically nothing happened. Maybe to the most sheltered people on the planet, but such a belief in mass surveillance wasn't exactly uncommon and certainly not treated as tinfoil-wearing crazy. However, there's a big difference between suspected and proven. Snowden just provided the receipts. The Pentagon has never been able to account for more than half its budget. This blows my mind every time I'm reminded of it. I worked at a small nonprofit, and the fear of failing an audit was something we thought of every day. Less scary when you know the guy doing the audits. Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, MCC, in New York City on August 10, 2019. On August 9, 2019, Epstein's cellmate was transferred out, but no one took his place. The two guards who were assigned to check his jail unit that night fell asleep and did not check on him for about 3 hours. 2 cameras in front of Epstein's cell also malfunctioned that night. I can't believe I forgot about Epstein and how many high-profile politicians and celebrities visited his island. It's barely even a story anymore. Years ago, in the lead to the Olympics in Mexico, the country was embarrassed by massive protests about conditions for regular people there. So at one of the large protests, they put snipers from their CIA equivalent in some tall buildings near where there was due to be a protest by a large government building. That building was guarded by a line of police officers. When the protesters made it to the line of police officers, they continued to peacefully protest. The CIA equivalent officers opened fire on the police, making it appear that the protesters were shooting at the cops. The cops retaliated, mowing down countless protesters, thinking they were defending themselves. Protesters were killed, and fled the scene. The government was ready, rushed in, and immediately cleaned up the scene. To this day they have no idea how many people were killed at the scene, and no one knew about the plot to instigate the massacre of the protesters until years later. It worked though, there were no more protests. Colin Powell went before the United Nations and cited false and misleading information in order to justify invading Iraq. I remember watching that speech and my wife said, "That man does not believe a single word that he is saying." It absolutely destroyed his political career, too. Prior to the Iraq War, Colin Powell was considered a national treasure and had broad support in polls from both Democrats and Republicans if he'd have run for president. If he'd run instead of Bush, he likely would have won. Instead, he threw his hat in with Bush, lied to the UN, and immediately went from being the presumptive first black U.S. president to one of the least trusted people in modern American history.